Mrs. Peniston, Lily's decorous aunt, is visited by a cousin, Grace Stepney, who dislikes Lily.
Mrs. Peniston laid down her crochet work. Gus Trenor? Lily and Gus Trenor? She said, growing so suddenly pale that her visitor was almost alarmed. Oh, Cousin Julia, of course I don't know what you do mean, said Mrs. Peniston, with a frightened quiver in her fretful voice. Such things were never heard of in my day, and my own niece. I'm not sure I understand you. Do people say he's in love with her? Mrs. Peniston's horror was genuine. People always say unpleasant things, and certainly they're a great deal together. A friend of mine met them the other afternoon in the park, quite late, after the lamps were lit. It's a pity Lily makes herself so conspicuous. Conspicuous? Gasped Mrs. Peniston. She bent forward, lowering her voice. What sort of things do they say? That he means to get a divorce and marry her? Grace Stepney laughed outright. Dear me, no. He would hardly do that. It's a flirtation, nothing more. A flirtation between my niece and a married man. Do you mean to tell me that with Lily's looks and advantages, she could find no better use for her time than to waste it on a fat, stupid man almost old enough to be her father? But that's the worst of it. People say she isn't wasting her time. Everyone knows, as you say, that Lily is too handsome and charming to devote herself to a man like Gus Trenor unless, echoed Mrs. Peniston. Unless, said Grace, leaning forward, unless there are material advantages to be gained by making herself agreeable to him. Mrs. Peniston put down her work again. If you take pleasure in annoying me by mysterious insinuations, she said coldly, you might at least have chosen a more suitable time than just as I am recovering from the strain of having given a large dinner. The mention of the dinner, to which Miss Stepney, at Lily's insistence, had not been invited, dispelled her last scruples. I don't know why I should be accused of taking pleasure in telling you about Lily. I was sure I shouldn't get any thanks for it, she returned with a flare of temper. But I have some family feeling left, and as you are the only person who has any authority over Lily, I thought you ought to know what is being said of her. Well, said Mrs. Peniston, what I complain of is that you haven't told me yet what is being said. I didn't suppose I should have to put it so plainly. People say that Gus Trenor pays her bills. Pays her bills? Mrs. Peniston broke into a laugh. I can't imagine where you could have picked up such rubbish. Lily has her own income. I provide for her very handsomely. Oh, we all know that, interposed Grace dryly. But Lily wears a great many smart gowns. Well, I like her to be well dressed. It's only suitable. Certainly, but then there are her gambling debts. Gambling debts? Lily! Mrs. Peniston's voice shook with anger and bewilderment. She wondered whether Grace Stepney had gone out of her mind. What do you mean by her gambling debts? Well, simply that if one plays for money, and Lily said one is liable to lose a great deal, and I don't suppose Lily always wins. Who told you my niece plays cards for money? Mercy, Cousin Julia, don't look at me as if I were trying to turn you against Lily. Everybody knows she's crazy about bridge. Mrs. Gryce told me herself that it was her gambling that frightened Percy Gryce. He was really taken with her at first, but of course among Lily's friends it's quite the custom for girls to play for money. In fact, people are inclined to excuse her on that account. To excuse her for what? Well, for being hard up and accepting attentions from men like Trenor and George Dorset. Mrs. Peniston gave another cry. George Dorset? Is there anyone else? I should like to know the worst, if you please. Well, don't put it that way, Cousin Julia. Lately, Lily has been a good deal with the Dorsets, and he seems to admire her. And she has been spending a great deal of money this winter. Evie Van Osburgh was at Celeste ordering her trousseau, and she told me that Celeste showed her the most exquisite things that she was sending home to Lily. And people say that Judy Trenor has quarreled with her on account of Gus, but I'm sure I'm sorry I spoke, though I meant it only as a kindness. Mrs. Peniston's genuine incredulity enabled her to dismiss Miss Stepney. But minds impenetrable to reason have generally some crack through which suspicion filters, and her visitor's insinuations did not glide off as easily as she had expected. Mrs. Peniston disliked scenes, and her determination to avoid them had always led her to hold herself aloof from the details of Lily's life. She had no immediate intention of repeating to Lily what she had heard. To do so might provoke a scene, and a scene, in the shaken state of Mrs. Peniston's nerves with the effects of her dinner not worn off, was a risk she deemed it her duty to avoid. But there remained in her thoughts a settled deposit of resentment against her niece. Mrs. Peniston felt as if there had been a contagious illness in the house.